Thank you, Sunny, for that. Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. For those of you in different time zones, I want to acknowledge that. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar to really discuss the topic of the statement of work and how to uncover those hidden costs of statement of work. So if we can go ahead and get started. My name is Joanna Estrada. I am the Global Head of Contingent Workforce Solutions Group within our Talent Innovation Center. I have a very small part in today's session. However, I do want to take the time to introduce you to the two colleagues within Randstad Oversight who have the majority of today's topics to cover with you. First of all, Scott Brewer is representing our Contingent Workforce Solutions as our Statement of Work Practice Lead. I'm going to keep our team fairly young, so Scott is bringing well over 8 years of experience in this remit here, so very happy to have him joining us today. Secondly, we have Rashid Smith, who's representing our international accounts from our EMEA team. So Rashid, also keeping very young, has well over 7 years of experience. For today's discussion, we have scheduled about an hour. We have a meaty discussion, if you will. As you can see here, the agenda includes such topics of how do we define statement of work and why is it so increasingly important? I think there's no denying that organizations are looking at a total talent or the impact of what's happening in the industry for many of the categories of labor, so we cannot ignore the statement of work. Secondarily, what are those drivers for incorporating or integrating your services procurement or statement of work within your current contingent workforce program if you have one today? Thirdly, how can you gain that total visibility, reduce risks, and avoid those hidden costs sometimes associated with miscategorization? So lastly, the topic we'll cover off is when does it make sense to bring in a contingent workforce partner that can make a difference. So with that said, I'm going to hand it over to our guest speakers today, and I believe we're going to start off on the very next slide for the very first topic.
All right, thanks, Joanne. So I will take it over. So if we're looking at the definition of the topic, there's a couple of things that we need to consider from a content perspective. So we're talking about element of the scope of the services, projects and oversight, roles and responsibility, and for example, the contract scope change management. So we see it as a very big area today. It's over 500 billion. That is estimated to be the global spend of SOW. And when you look from a professional services spend in the US only, it's a 1.8 trillion. So that alludes already the size and shape of SOW and why that is really important to have a view on that one. Scott, if you move to the next one. So what are some of the key trends that actually accelerate SOW growth at the very moment? So we see a couple of things here. So technical and digital transformation, that definitely puts a lot of pressure in what are the business critical skills, and for that, the competition around those skills. So we see the changes in the marketplace that actually cause new areas of business critical skills. But that also means that the professional talent pools to find those skills are actually shrinking. And that's well recognized by a lot of companies. And that's also one of the reasons that they're seeking for outsourcing that expertise, to be covering that by another party and to stay with their own core business because they see that it's increasingly more difficult to find those talents. The other part on that one is that if you look at what the market is telling us, is that the business leaders are more and more worried about the scarcity that is actually occurring in the marketplace. There's actually 67% that sees that and is really concerned about those trends and whether they are able to provide their strategy or realize that strategy into the future. if you look at the independent contractor market, or freelance space, if you will, and the amount of SOW workers today, and you compare that to the total workforce, that's already 40% of the total workforce out there today. And the expectation on all the growth that we see is that that will actually increase to further to 50% about 2030, which you see that is still a significant growth over the next coming years. If you go to the next slide. So I think the big question for all of the clients and all the people in the marketplace is, do you have truly SOW visibility? So a question like, do you know who is providing SOW services within your company? Do you know how much they're spending at any given moment in time? And do you know the number of projects that are actually running in your company? A lot of international companies, bigger companies that grew by merger and acquisitions have multiple systems, which we know that it's sometimes very difficult to get an answer, for example, on that question. The other part is when it comes, for example, for payment, do you actually know that when you release a payment that is done on delivered completion of the scope? Or is it because there is an invoice sent and somebody improves the invoice without checking whether the deliverable is actually being completed? Then I think a big area where there's a lot of money hidden is, are we actually rightfully contracting as a W, or is it just a staff augmentation assignment? Very often we see companies that have multiple disciplines, so they have multiple procurement partners in a company that are responsible for different areas. So statement of work is very often separated from contingent. So there's not necessarily an overall view on assignments, whether it needs to be a statement of work or staff augmentation. So maybe also for the purpose of some speed, the other part is also the creation of an SOW with an approved standard. So do all statement of works are equally being contracted with the same rules, same templates, consistent and compliant to ensure that there's a seamless, harmonized process across any of your markets of any of those countries. So we see, for example, there's still a lot of companies that are being confronted by procurement fraud because it's wrongly contracted, and that annualized quite to an extensive amount when you look to that from a global perspective. We move on to the next slide. So we see that the SOW and services procurement, they are actually representing the biggest opportunity in the modern contingent workforce management programs, as it is the largest area in the contingent labor spend. Typically, it's anywhere between 6 to 12 times the normal contingent workforce volume when it comes to statement of work or services procurement. If we move to the next one. So what do we see in the market from a growing perspective? So although staff augmentation or temporary labor is still, if you consider that from an MSP program perspective, the biggest part. But if you look at a growth number, you see that SOW still continues to grow very fast. It grows faster than the contingent labor within the space of the MSP. So it's a huge growth area, and it becomes more and more recognized by the companies that SOW needs to be part of their MSP program because it's such a big, sometimes uncontrolled spend area within their company. If you move to the next one. So where does that typically happen from a category perspective? And as most of you would recognize, it's obviously in the IT space. It's a large area where a lot of SOWs are taking place globally, but also in the professional services and somewhat less in some of the other categories. Knowing that we are heavily digitalizing in a global space, also from a service perspective, you could see that these already big areas will continue to grow from a category perspective. And I will hand over back to Scott to take you through the next steps.
Great. Thanks, Rashid. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Just want to make sure. I was having some mic trouble earlier today. So thanks, Rashid, for going through that, and thanks, Joanne, with being generous in terms of my years of experience. So we're going to cover some great topics this afternoon, so you can see why SOW is such a priority in the marketplace. It's a priority for Randstad. It's an area that we're very, very excited about. And our goal today is really just to educate you in a couple different areas. So what we'd like to do is dive into the drivers and the pain points that most companies were experiencing before they made the decision to go with a formal program. We're going to dive into also the vendor management system technologies and the features that are associated with it, because there's a strong correlation between the vendor management system technology and the associated services that can come with it. We're going to talk about what's possible, the different service models, and some of the benefits that are associated with those. And then we've got some stories from the streets or experiences that we've had from different programs and what we read in the industry about determining where to start and what to think about. And then we've got information on a couple case studies, and then we've got an assessment overview at the end. So I'm going to be talking for the majority of the slides, but I welcome my colleagues to jump in at any time, or if there's any other questions along the way, I encourage you to ask them. Okay. So why don't we start by talking about the situation that most companies face when they're managing SOW or services procurement. And what we're attempting to show here on the left-hand side are each one of these circles represent an independent system. When you're managing services, it has very unique environments or characteristics because you're balancing, excuse me, you're balancing the contract, you're balancing elements of the invoicing, but you also have a worker piece associated with it. And so an example, when the companies that we work with, and I think in the industry, they come with the fact that they're trying to manage services procurement in 4 separate systems or modules. So they might have an SOW contracting system where the contracts are bid, they're negotiated, and they're stored, or it could even be that they're having Microsoft Word documents or PDF documents stored on a SharePoint site. They have, or they may have an HRIS system where some of these non-FTE workers, like SOW workers or outsourced workers, are stored, but it's somewhat of a standalone system because it's not capturing some of the rate information associated with an SOW. The SOW that's created, or the budget amount for that, may feed over or is entered into a purchase order system, an invoicing system, and then you start invoicing against the SOW. And then the performance information about how well the supplier is doing may be in a CRM system at best, but more than likely we see them being on the hard drives of some of the project managers about specifically managing the suppliers. So this interdependency, or I guess the lack of it, is causing challenges on 3 levels. The first one is if you're responsible for looking for compliance savings and optimization and how well these are performing, you're having to try to pull it from 4 separate systems that aren't necessarily connected. The other piece is, let's say you get the portions of it, they're at different levels. For example, you might have an SOW that has fee-based billing or schedules. Well, you might create a PO line that correlates to one of those schedules, but if it's billed on a worker rate, an hourly rate for a role, that is going to be buried in the SOW document itself, and it's not within the HRIS. So if you're trying to do comparisons, you're at different levels along the way. The third challenge that we see with this is the items or the environments aren't interdependent in terms of synchronizing each other. So an example is you might start an SOW contract. It has a total budget. You create the purchase order for that, and then you slate the workers to start and end when that contract SOW was supposed to start and end. Well, let's say that SOW goes over in terms of delivery. It's going to go over in terms of dates and also in terms of budgets. It's rare that we see that someone goes back and updates the SOW for the change order, and someone goes in automatically and updates the dates in the HRIS system for those workers. And so it's a sort of a recipe for creating gaps because it's not flexible and they don't speak to each other. So that's the environment we come into. So we started talking initially about technology, but this is the platform challenge that a lot of companies had before they started to make the leap or consideration of it. And so what does that mean in terms of managing it or thinking about the drivers to make the decision to go to a more formal program solution. So we have the general categories here of visibility, compliance, savings, and then supplier performance reporting. In our opinion, visibility is number one, and it's usually the number one challenge in the industry. And it's like we were talking about before, if you're struggling to pull in that information from different sources and different levels, it's hard to enforce compliance or monitor it, savings calculations, decisions on it. So the other three I consider somewhat of a symptom of it. And it's interesting when we come into the environments with companies, we'll ask them what their spend is, and they'll start pulling reports off accounts payable system, and there's a lot of other system categories buried in there, like travel, utility expense, et cetera, and it's not even well isolated just from the general ledger. From a compliance standpoint, there are three main pain points that we get approached with about what they're trying to solve for. Could be all three. Most cases they are. It's centered around the supplier worker, the supplier enrollment themselves, and then the SOW contract. And the concerns that we get approached with about supplier workers are we're unsure if the background screens that we require or the onboarding NDA forms are getting signed out and populated and validated for these workers. And the common challenge we see with this is that SOW workers tend to be transient in nature, right? So you may have a long-standing project. They may start with their senior project manager, but by the end they've swapped out a junior. And so you've got changing resources coming on. The exposure we get asked about is, how do I make sure that that worker who's left doesn't still have access to the systems? And it's something that they've come to us with. And there's a specific module that the VMS companies have introduced specifically to attack that. And we'll cover that in a minute. The other item is the supplier enrollment. And the challenges we hear, and this is probably not new to some of you, is that procurement isn't always involved in the enrollment up front of the suppliers that are being engaged. And we hear stories about the situations where procurement sometimes learns about the supplier being considered by the project manager when the first contract comes through, or even worse, when the first invoice comes through, and looking for more controls around that. And then on the SOW contract, it's related to what Rashid was talking about earlier. Are the contracts that are being drafted with the suppliers, are they on the company's paper or are they on the supplier's paper? Are the company boilerplate standard terms being enforced, or is there variability? And is it really SOW? Is someone in the organization really looking to see, are there deliverables, service level agreements, and acceptance criteria showing that risk over? For savings, to me it stems again from the visibility challenges. I think there are basic savings challenges in terms of enforcing the basic budgets of the SOW and the amendments, and then that lack of visibility, not being able to do the benchmark comparison of I'm paying a certain rate for a certain role for a certain fee, I'm having trouble benchmarking it to see if it's competitive. The last pain point is on supplier performance reporting, and we did talk about this a little bit earlier on the earlier slide, is that oftentimes I think companies are making decisions on a tier one supplier just based upon their spend volume, when really there's more information about their compliance or on-time delivery, things like that, that is being recorded by a project manager, but it's not boiling up to the people that make decisions about whether that supplier should be a tier one, whether they should be remaining in program, et cetera. So these are the main topics or the main pain points that a company is looking to solve for when they're deciding to make that investment or the next step to a formal program. Okay, so now we're going to start to talk about what it looks like from a solution standpoint. How does the structure come together from a technology standpoint? And then how does an MSP come in and supplement and deliver their services? We talked about earlier about the challenges of the different systems. And oftentimes the total service layer, one of the primary influences is the design of the system that supports it. So we're going to talk about that first. If you have an integrated vendor management system technology that's guided or oriented around managing services procurement, it manages each one of the individual segments that we talked about before. First and foremost, it's integrated. So the items surrounding the SOW terms and agreement and that length is linked to the budget that you're entering, and it's linked to the invoicing. So then if there's an overage that needs to happen on the actual invoicing, it can force an SOW amendment requirement. If that amendment needs to go long and the invoicing needs to go over, it's usually because there's a date that's extended. It can feed and synchronize to the worker details to make sure that those workers are extended so that they don't lose access. And that information about them going over on their budget for that supplier is fed over to the supplier management information to show that they went over on their budget and also on their timeline that we can use for supplier reporting. So I like to think about it, it's a platform that's interrelated, so that way you're able to get all the information as you pull the data. It's all at the same level. The worker roles and rates are captured down to the worker level, and you can pull it that way. And it's interdependent. As one piece changes, the other portions can flex and adapt. The one thing I wanted to make sure to emphasize here, an MSP layer is very, very important to make sure that these components work together. The technology is great, but there are different entry points. A manager is going to create the initial project. He needs to know which template to use. He needs to know what values to keep updated. A supplier is going to enter their worker. They need to know how to enter that information and keep it updated. There's going to be information about supplier performance that needs input from the project manager. That MSP layer keeps all those components accurate and in sync and make sure that the technology can be fully realized. Okay. So we've talked about the challenges with the technology separation, how a VMS can cover that in generality. What we want to do now is we're going to dive deeper into the components of the VMS that can support this. So it's a little bit deeper layer, and I'm going to cover that, and then we'll lay it into how it correlates to the service components on the life cycle. Okay. So what each one of these chevrons represents are the different module capabilities within a VMS technology that has SOW or services procurement modules or capability. And each one of these chevrons in a way is representing a life cycle step. So if you were to read it left to right, most SOWs have a life cycle step where that is collected, the requirements are assembled, and it's bid out. The next step is doing the contracting phase, negotiating the contract. The next part is projects and pay bills, so it's invoice management, deliverables management. And then the other piece is worker resource tracking. And the point that we want to make sure that you understand here, the functionality of the different pieces and the fact that they're interchangeable. There are different components you can turn on as part of an SOW solution. I'll hit some of the major functionality points, and I'm going to start working with basic on the right, and I'll sort of work my way up the chain. So the VMS technologies have what's called a resource tracking functionality, with different names for them, but its core tenet is to provide visibility and tracking and compliance associated with SOW workers or outsourced services workers where there is no invoicing done within the VMS. It's really just about tracking who they are, their supplier, who they're working for, dates, compliance, and we find it's most effective when it's integrated with a client's badging and networking systems as that sort of that sole source of truth, right? They're onboarded, it feeds over, and then when they leave, you're updating it in the VMS, and it can trigger that deep provisioning part. So it's a great step for companies that want to solve that specific need without making the leap or looking at some of the more advanced functionality. If I work my way up the chain, so now I want to start bringing in, or what the project's pay bill functionality does, is it brings in the support for everything after the SOW has been signed. So if you have an SOW, you have the milestones, the terms, the dates, the budgets, and now you need to get it into an accounting system where you're managing the deliverables, you're managing the budgets, you're creating it in a framework that you can manage the deliverables and the invoicing through the life of the project, and that's what that is. And we'll go into a little bit more about how that's maintained, but it's basically the back office transaction support for how the invoicing and deliverables are managed. If I work my way up the chain again, there is an electronic SOW authoring and collaboration. You might hear people talk about this as a redlining feature. What this is you're now taking what might be a manual process for SOW negotiation, you're getting it out of Microsoft Word, and you're actually negotiating it and building it within the VMS system itself. So your boilerplate clauses in terms of indemnifications can be in there, your service scope, your acceptance criteria, that can be built out as fields within the system. And then there's a back and forth, excuse me, I'm losing my voice. There's a back and forth collaboration between the project buyer and the supplier to finalize the terms. And you can redline it, you can adjust it, and it expedites the contracting process, and it uses an electronic SOW to be the authorization to move forward instead of maybe a hard copy version. And if I work my way fully up the chain, is competitive bid or RFX. And this is an open forum technology within the VMS where a project manager or someone in procurement or someone else within the company enters their requirements for what they want from this particular project. They may not have an idea about how they want it to be billed. They might not even know their initial budget yet, but they're going to use this technology to capture the requirements. It distributes it out to the suppliers that are enrolled in the program. They respond back against the criteria that the manager entered in terms of budget, start date, finish date, maybe certifications, other rating criteria, and you can use it to make the award or the decision of all the suppliers. And then once that's awarded, it kind of works its way downstream. So it's awarded, negotiated, you set up the environment to bill it and manage the deliverables, and you can also track the workers associated with it as well. So I know I went really deep on that one. I just thought it was important to know, and there's a theme in the SOW program management space, is that there's variability, and it's really about what is most applicable for a client, and I just wanted to make sure that you knew that the decisions or the options that are available to you from a systems perspective. Okay, so now why don't we start going into a situation where we start laying in that technology into a normal procurement process, and then we're also going to drop in the MSP service layer so you can see what a provider can do as part of the service. And when we're asked to explain what an SOW program is, I try to start the conversation with this slide, and it's 7 steps, and they're pretty basic. It's the bidding process, it's the evaluation of the bids, it's awarding of the contract and negotiating it. The project setup is some accounting network, either a purchase order or some other system to manage the invoicing and the accounting structure. There's the engagement of the resources and screening them. There are the actual submissions for deliverable acceptance, approval, and then facilitation of invoicing. And most SOWs go through this step from the pre-sourcing and negotiation activities all the way through. And what a program solution is you are choosing elements of our vendor management system to manage all or parts of this, and you're choosing an MSP partner in most cases to supplement and accompany and advise on all or partial of this depending on what the needs are. The MSP has a little bit more variability because we can be an advisor for that particular step. We can be an auditor too, or we can actually be a leader depending on what's elected. But we'll get into that a little bit later. The example I wanted to show you is just to show the variability and the importance of the design process. So when a company considers going with an SOW solution, they should be working with a partner, multiple. They might be working with a VMS partner and also an MSP partner, and they should be consulting them on their current environment, their needs, and what they should be considering from both. And so I'm going to walk you through an example just to show you the variability, and then we'll get a little bit deeper into the models. So in my representative example company, they would like to utilize a vendor management system to support it because they have certain deficiencies in their current systems. So in this instance, you can see with the check marks, they might use the bidding, the RFX bidding capability to manage the bid and the evaluation process. They might already have a recently implemented Ariba contract management solution, so that online collaboration that's in the vendor management system just isn't that much of a value add, not enough to break away. But what they do want to do is once they've negotiated and finalized it, they want to use the VMS to manage the back office portions that we talked about, leverage the deliverables, the tracking, the worker administration, et cetera. And as part of a consultation process, typically, the MSP provider should come in and talk to them about value. Remember, we talked about in-house competency and the technology that they had and availability of staff. In this example, the MSP might be elected to help the project managers create the bid, help them do the Q&A back and forth with the supplier, but the client is elected for choosing the specific award. We're going to keep that in-house. We'll keep the contract system that we have. But from an MSP perspective, we definitely want someone from the MSP team to assist with creating the record, setting up the deliverables, assisting with confirming the screens, and then overseeing, basically shepherding the invoicing and deliverables process for the end. So this is just one example, but the goal was to show you the variability that's possible, and I guess the importance of considering what your current environment is in terms of what technology will solve my current challenges, and then also what might an MSP service provider do. If there's no other questions, I'm going to go on. We're going to go through the different service models that are available in the industry, and these are pretty standard. Before we do that, we want to dive in a little deeper in terms of the considerations that we think companies should think about, and if they're going through an assessment or a prospect process, they definitely should be thinking about these when they consider what components to turn on in the technology and the service. I'll get started on those. Okay, so what we're trying to show here is each one of those yellow circles going around the sprocket wheel are things that a company we think should consider when they're thinking about, okay, I want to go on this journey. What components do I want to manage? What components do I want to use the technology for? These are some of the major things that will influence it. For the sake of time, I won't go through all of them. I'm just going to hit some of the ones that we think are of major consideration to think about. The first one is the culture in regards to change management, mandates, and how they enforce inceptions. And I would say to a company that what has been your past experience when you are kicking off a new initiative or a technology? Does the executive team get strongly behind it? Are there naughty lists that are published and enforced for those folks that don't use it? Or is it more of, let's start this initiative and it will grow if it proves and shows value? A program can do either, but that level of mandate and exception enforcement can influence how progressive you go with some of the first solutions that are there. I think we hit this concept before in terms of existing technology. If there are newly implemented technology or you have something that solves one of those items in those 7 steps, then it definitely makes sense to not consider bringing it in. You may want to keep what you have for a specific segment. The other part of that bullet is speaking to, and it's not really competency, it's more about coverage. And so we ask companies to say, okay, for your sourcing activities, is your procurement group covering all, or are there certain categories that they just can't cover just because of available capacity, or are there certain dollar amount thresholds that they leave it to the project buyer to do the sourcing and negotiation on? If there's that opportunity, that may be a window potentially for the MSP to come in and help, just depending on what the coverage and capacity is. 2 of the parts I'll talk about, and it's somewhat related to the prioritization for what you're trying to go after in a program. The first one is determining, is compliance my priority? And I'll just share with you, sometimes customers come to us and they have just not done very well in an audit. So they had someone come through and check their background screen to their workers, or someone audited their contracts and there's lots of misclassification. And they come with a burning platform that says, my number one need right now is compliance around the workers. I have to get this fixed. And those other elements would be great, but let me do a step first and solve this priority need. The other piece is savings timeline tolerance, and I'll try to explain what I mean, is that when you implement a program, we talked about the different drivers, right? There's visibility, there are compliance challenges, et cetera. Well, savings is one of those things that you could definitely go after. Oftentimes, there's a decision to make in terms of how much do I implement of the program that solves my needs for visibility and compliance versus maybe savings is a second wave initiative or a later phase initiative. We would just advise you before you embark on this is to say, do I have to show hard dollar savings in year one, or can it be more acceptance in terms of foundational steps? Can I implement a basic program first, and then I start going after more elements of savings in year two or potentially year three? Make sense so far? Okay. We're going to start going into next the 4 major models, and I think most MSP providers have this basic structure. We definitely see it because with the RFPs we get, we're asked to break out our services in these different types. So it's very, very similar in terms of how they're packaged. So I think this is representative of the industry. So the way that we're trying to lay this out here is there are 4 different services that are possible, and it works from complexity or I guess value of services from left to right, where resource tracking is one of the more basic ones, and we're trying to show the correlation to the VMS technology that's turned on. So as we work our way left to right, we're adding more functionality for the most part to the VMS, and then the MSP is typically taking on additional services. And not every company fits neatly into these cookie cutter molds, but I'd say most look to solve in one of these models, and either there's a variation or there's a progression where they start at one of these knowing that they're going to advance to another. And I'll hit the highlights in terms of the structure, and then we'll talk about the benefits on the next slide. So starting with MSP, MSP resource tracking, this is where you're using specifically the resource tracking functionality. You're capturing the worker information, the compliance information, et cetera. The MSP role in this is typically assisted entry, and it's also auditing. So they're going to help the supplier record their workers. They're going to help the association to the sponsoring manager. They're going to be checking to make sure that the supplier has completed their screening information, and if there's an automated feed, they're likely going to be looking for kickouts between the two systems. If I keep working my way to the right-hand side, this transaction administration, and we talked a little bit about this before, this is managing the last 4 steps of that services procurement lifecycle. It's capturing the deliverables, the invoice management items, the cost center, the structure, the rates, and you're managing everything after the SOW is signed. The MSP role is really about making sure that the information that's recorded by the supplier or the manager is accurate. They're choosing the right templates. They're monitoring the deliverables, and they're making sure everything gets executed properly in the system in correlation to what's being delivered. If I work my way over to MSP-assisted sourcing, you can see more checkbox down below in terms of the VMS. I'm now turning on SOW authoring, and we're now turning on RFX bid. And what the client has elected here is to bring the full cycle in, all the way from bid through invoice payment, that they'll have that visibility to do that. The role of the MSP here is not owning any of those sourcing and negotiation steps, but we're a facilitator and they're a policy advisor. So the manager that's creating it or procurement is getting guidance from the MSP in terms of how to use the tool. They're making sure that the supplier responds properly. And with the negotiation or the SOW authoring, we're not leading the negotiation, but we're making sure that they're using the right template, it's populated correctly, and it's an opportunity for the MSP to do an SOW audit because the terms are being drafted right in front of them. So they could potentially audit for misclassification at that standpoint. And then with MSP-led sourcing, this is basically just assisting or getting assistance from the MSP to help do the initial sourcing and the initial negotiation for usually select categories of what procurement may be struggling to handle in terms of, procurement might handle IT, but they may not be able to handle another smaller category, or an MSP may be entrusted with smaller dollar SOWs. But basically, it's an assisted function to help gain more savings in contract compliance. All right. If there's no other questions, I'll go ahead and move on. What we're trying to show on this slide are basically a summary of the benefits that are possible associated with each one, and we're showing it on a progression or a maturity curve with the intent that we work with companies, and I think this is also true of other companies in the industry. Aspirationally, they may want to bring in competitive bidding and more contract standard template usage, but it may make sense for their business environment, for change management, for other reasons to start at one of the lower, lesser levels and be aspirational to building up over time. And there are definite reasons and benefits for doing that. And I'll go ahead and speak to one of the advanced slides now. Is we often see companies starting with MSP transaction administration because it's solving for some of the predominant challenges of visibility of all those components that we talked about before, but it's not touching some of those items that can be sensitive in terms of enforcing forced bidding or enforcing forced new standardized templates. If you start with this level, oftentimes it solves some of the bigger problems of the project managers and suppliers because it's automating and taking care of some of the back office transactions, and you're able to use the data that you're collecting in this level 1 solution to be ready to expand to level 2 or level 3. And the example I would give you is if you want to use the RFX module, one of the key features of it is knowing the service categories and competencies of your supplier base. If any of that information is lacking, if you let level 1 run for 12 months to 18 months, you're going to know which suppliers are really good at servicing which categories so that you can set up properly here. The other example is SOW bid templates. You might want to standardize your the SOW contract templates. You can use the level 1 to collect the examples of SOWs and then use it to improve your particular setup and services along the way. And just some lessons from the street and our experience. We've already talked about transaction administration. It's a great place to start. With resource tracking management, it's also a good place to start, especially if your focus is just upon the compliance piece. The recommendation we would give you, if you're going to do it, make the investment for the systems and facilities access connection. It's a great starting point to keep those connected. And the lesson learned from us is if there's no billing associated with these workers in the VMS and there's no linkage to access control, keeping that worker information updated is an effort because the suppliers just don't have the incentive. So our recommendation is if you start here, work on the integration. And the other pieces I would just say, if you're going to go with a more advanced services, it just thrives in a mandate environment. In that if you're thinking about, well, I want my project managers to bid out this work for SOWs that are below a certain level, they're not necessarily going to be incented to do it because they're, as you know, more focused on probably time and delivery of the project. So we think that it's important if a company makes the decision to go that route that they should have some executive endorsement and a promotion policy behind it really to get the value out of those additional services. All right, I think I've got about 14 minutes left. I'm just going to pause here. What we're going to go through next are specific program benefits. We're going to go through a little bit more about cost savings levers. We've got information on some case studies and then our assessment process at the end. I may try to pick up the pace a little bit just so that we can get to any questions at the end. So I'll just go from there. Okay. This next slide is just another visual representation of some of the benefits that we talked about on the different service levels. The piece that we've done differently is we've just categorized it by the typical tenets of an operating program. And I'm not going to go through each one because hopefully these bullets look pretty familiar to you. The piece that I would just emphasize, and we talked about this a little bit when we were talking about the integrated solution, is the importance of a good MSP partner in enabling the success against each one of these categories. And the example I would give in the visibility section is that when you implement a VMS technology, if you choose an MSP partner that has experience with doing this, they're going to have best practices in terms of templates, configuration, workflow items that they're going to bring to the table, and they're going to consult with you to make sure that it also aligns with your process. A company will benefit from a MSP provider that's been there. And there's also a statistic, and forgive me if I'm misquoting it, but I think a little while ago, staffing industry analysts said that about 70% of all implementation work is done by MSPs. So it's really a good repository to have that experience, and setup is critical. The other piece that we talked about is that the MSP has a role in making sure that the information is accurate and that it's timely. And I think one thing that's overlooked is that it's easy to use, right? So when that manager is creating it for the first time, an MSP steps in. When a supplier doesn't know what to do, an MSP steps in. They're going to come in and make sure that that is successful. For the compliance piece, we talked about those three problem areas. Remember the workers, the suppliers, and the SOW agreement. The MSP, a valued MSP and one that brings that experience, is going to supplement where the technology leads off. They can audit the SOW terms on your behalf. They can validate that the suppliers that are becoming part of the program have the right insurances that you require, an MSA, and they're vetted before they're added for selection. For savings, I'm going to get into some of the additional levers, so I won't go into it here. There's just different roles that a valued MSP can play. And then efficiency and quality, I would just stress to the fact that, and it's related to data entry accuracy, is that the information about how well the supplier did on their budget, their timeline, and qualitative scores, a good MSP provider will compile that together, and it will be part of a supplier report that is given to the business to make decisions about coverage. Are they doing well? Are they not doing well? Okay. One other point on benefits, and we were taking a bet on which slide would be the surprise, and I think this is the biggest one. I think most companies think that when you implement a program, it's a enforced mandate on the supplier community and it's a tax, right? They're going to have to just eat it to be part of the program. That's not the case. There are elements where suppliers benefit, and a good MSP should have this as part of their change management program to emphasize this. The three benefits, just for the sake of brevity, is that the suppliers that are enrolled are going to get access to buyers that they didn't previously. So their service competencies will be loaded. They're going to have access, or more people will see them for selection possibilities. They're going to have a possibility for speed to revenue. If an MSP is automating the contract cycle and the approval cycle and onboarding of the workers, it's speed to contract, speed to worker engagement. They're going to be able to bill faster, typically, than they were before. And the third item is accelerated collection. So all the prompts that VMS system will do in the MSP in terms of priming when the invoicing is due or the deliverables are due for improvement, it's going to speed the collections along, and they're going to benefit from it as well.
Scott, hi, it's Joanne. I love that slide. I think it shows not only the value to the suppliers, but this messaging is so critical to also include in the change management within an organization. so that they are aware of. There absolutely are benefits to suppliers to be part of this program, and these are some of the benefits that the suppliers will receive. I think oftentimes, suppliers may have their relationships with people within the organization, but making sure that there is an understanding on both sides of the buy and the supply side for the benefits is so important and will allow for an increased adoption.
Yep. Absolutely. Thanks, Joanne. Any other questions while we paused on that? Okay. Thank you. Oh, sorry about that. So the next topic we wanted to discuss with you are the typical savings levers that are possible in the SOW program space. And I think most people think automatically, competitive bidding, right, or RFX. That's the typical lever I'm going to be looking at. And it definitely is one of them, but we wanted to make sure that you knew that there were other levers that can be pulled. And we thought we'd have just a conversation briefly about some of the levers and some of the mechanics associated with it that are possible. And the way that we've tried to lay this out is that the different tactics or levers work from sort of a basic to a more strategic level as you work your way down. We also tried to lay it in terms of which service level is the savings lever possible. Like if it's relying on competitive bidding, it really needs to rely on a level 2 or 3 above. And the thing that we would tell you is that the degree of any savings that you can try to go after and capture is really based upon a few things. And the first one is that the services, what the services are that you've elected that we just talked about. What's the pre-program environment in terms of how loose was a particular control before this came in place, and then also the degree of mandates that are there. So these are definitely possible. We just want to make sure in level set that there are some considerations in terms of the how quickly you can turn the dial. And I'll hit some of a couple ones that I think are important. From a budget control standpoint, so what we read in the industry is that if you're moving from an environment where there are loose controls on the initial budget, on SOW amendments, and also invoice releases, putting in a process and a technology to provide that scrutiny on it will accelerate the right behavior, or should I say creates negative pressure for the suppliers, where if they're going to go over on a particular budget item or an amendment, it will flag for approvals, and they're going to think twice about it before it shows on their executive scorecard. So it may be hard to measure, but it's definitely something that's tangible depending on what was already there before. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip around to a couple one. This next one is convert misclassified SOWs. And so what we see and what we read in the industry is that there's typically about a 20% at least misclassification of SOWs that are really staff augmentation. And as you all know, bill rates on the SOW space are much, much higher than staff augmentation. As part of a program, if you're getting visibility of those SOWs, you can look for the deliverables, the acceptance criteria, the burden and risk shift to the supplier. And if it's not there, that's a prime candidate to shift it potentially over to a staff augmentation provider, or with that same provider to get a much lower rate. So on a per SOW basis, the savings are pretty high, but from a business process perspective, there just has to be some consideration and enforcement. Last one I'll hit on here is supplier optimization. And I like to think of this as that the visibility enables some of the improvements, and this is not a concept that's new to procurement, and that's approaching the tail spend or eliminating it. We think by having the visibility associated with all this information, you're able to look at your spread of spend for a category, looking at what is not concentrated with your larger tier suppliers, using that information to shift the volume over to your larger tiers and realize some economies of scale or revised pricing based upon centralizing that spend with that visibility. Okay, I know we only have a couple of minutes left. I'm just going to show you one case study, and then I'll open it up for questions. This is a food service distributor in the U.S. Some of their challenges were sort of the storybook opening that we had about visibility challenges. Specifically for them, they were buying IT services, and there was significant crossover between StaffHog and SOW. And so the only determination really was, I'm going to buy in StaffHog until the tenure limits are there for the worker, and then they would hop over. So they knew they had a lot of opportunity to be able to control this. We helped put in a program for them with the VMS. They decided to bring in both staff augmentation and SOW. It was started out small, 7 million SOW in the first year. We're now up to 33 million. And what they were able to do is they weren't the judge and the jury in the beginning. They let the information come in, and then they saw the disparity. They saw the roles, the titles, and the suppliers. We assisted them with doing an RFI, and they agreed that they were going to buy their services under an SOW structure. We were able to convert some of the existing SOW worker agreements to a preferred supplier, and we have a new rate card that's in place for 2019, and we're tracking cost avoidance for them. So in my mind, this is a story about a disparate environment, lack of visibility. The technology brought the visibility, and then we were able to assist them by using the technology to change their procurement practice for the better and for savings. Okay. I think for the sake of time, there's only 2 more minutes, I believe. So I'm going to stop there. There are additional services that we can provide to you in terms of assessments, and I think we can distribute the deck after it's covered in there. We just want to make sure that you knew our passion for this space, and we're here for any opportunities that you want to talk to us about or any type of market learnings, and we welcome that. And then, Sunny, at this time, I think I'll turn it over unless there are any questions that we can field in the time we have.
Yes, Scott, we got one question from Tracy Pemberton. So sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, Tracy. And the question was, can you launch an SOW program without having a contingent workforce hourly or daily programs?
So if I understand, can you have an SOW program with an MSP without having a staff augmentation MSP segment?
Yes, so without contingent workforce programs, indeed, yeah.
Yeah, I think you can. So if I'm understanding it correctly, you don't have to rely on having an existing StaffHog MSP program in place to launch an SOW program. As Rashid was saying, it's a bigger spend category, and it's deserving of its own dedicated focus. I think there are benefits by having both sides, right? Because if you have one sort of escaping to the other, or you're leveraging some of the technology or integrations between the two, but I definitely think you can have a dedicated SOW MSP program.
Yes, and we also another question, Scott, is if people want to have a discussion about SOW, who they need to reach out. Myself,
Joanne, or Rashid. Joanne or Rashid, I'll be point person if you'd like, so we can distribute my contact information after this, and feel free to contact me, and I'd be happy to talk to anyone that's interested.
Absolutely. I think that makes complete sense. We'll have Scott be the point person, and any further conversations that we would like to have after this session, happy to.
Excellent. Perfect. I think also one question that we received is the slide deck, the presentation and the video recording of the webinar will be shared. So yes, tomorrow you will receive an email with the recording from the webinar and the slide deck. And also, indeed, we will make sure that the contact details from the speaker are included, so you will be able to read that back to them as well. So as I don't see any other questions, but please email us, and we will make sure that we come back to you afterwards if you have any questions. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you all for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.